And I think that this is perhaps the most crucial moment in understanding the beginning of the war in Bosnia, which is when the United States recognized Bosnia's independence in April 1992. And that's when the tensions in Bosnia really erupted into a proper inferno and into a disastrous civil war. And by the way, I should say, even though this is not in my article, the US intelligence community predicted that. Lots of people predicted that, actually. The UN Secretary General predicted that as well. Many international diplomats predicted that because they recognized that if Bosnia was to declare independence in this way, then the different national groups would fight to, in the case of the Serbs, stay within Yugoslavia. They would resist being pulled out of Yugoslavia into this newly created Bosnian state. And there would basically be a process of civil war and ethnic cleansing, which is, of course, exactly what happened.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Harry Blain, an assistant professor for political science at Sacramento State University. On this channel, we've been running several programs on the wars in the former Yugoslavia, and Harry actually wrote a paper on the subject called The Myth of Coercive Diplomacy, the US intelligence community, and the war in Bosnia, in which he explores declassified US intelligence documents on the wars in Yugoslavia. So this is what we want to talk about today. Harry, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Pascal.
Thanks for reaching out and for showing me this paper of yours, because it's highly fascinating that you kind of unearthed the, let's call it, intelligence assessment of this period, especially 92, 93, 94, versus then what we know what the public rhetoric of the Clinton administration was. Can you maybe give us a rundown of what you found out from these documents, which have been, as you said, told me earlier, been declassified for a while, actually?
Yeah, so the documents were declassified in 2013. They were declassified by the CIA and also by the Clinton Presidential Library. And most of them are intelligence assessments of various kinds, primarily from the Balkan Task Force, which was established by the CIA in June 1992, basically to study all aspects of the wars in Yugoslavia, but particularly the war in Bosnia, which by that point had been going on for a couple of months. And the documents definitely have a massive contrast compared to what's been said in public by the Clinton administration and by members of the Clinton administration since the war as well. I think in broad terms, the way that I would put it is that from the beginning of the war and from the beginning of the Clinton administration being in office, the intelligence community was repeatedly warning that efforts to engage in any kind of military intervention in Bosnia would be disastrous or would be ineffective and would probably prolong and worsen the war. Whereas in public, the administration was constantly either flirting with different forms of intervention in Bosnia or carrying them out, in fact. And this really went on throughout the war until around about 1995, when the Clinton administration finally began to accept that the war was intractable and gave up on a lot of these proposals and ultimately pursued the Dayton Peace Agreement, which provided quite significant concessions to the Bosnian Serb side of the war that previously the administration was totally unwilling to countenance, and basically described as akin to being appeasement or legitimization of ethnic cleansing or otherwise completely unpalatable actions. And I think that basically what happened is that throughout this process, the Clinton administration was able to disguise what really happened, because what they did towards the end of the war is that they did carry out quite a significant air campaign, in particular against the Bosnian Serbs. It was under the aegis of NATO, and it was called Operation Deliberate Force. And the Dayton Agreement came soon after that. So I think that gave the impression that the bombing basically made the intransigent Bosnian Serb leaders come to the negotiating table and bring about the Dayton Peace Accord. But the intelligence documents tell a very, very different story. And I think that the key thing that they show is that the war was intractable from the beginning, that these kinds of interventions were either unnecessary or potentially very dangerous. And also critically, that from the beginning of the Clinton administration, at least, the Bosnian Serb leaders were willing to make a peace agreement, and actually were willing to make a peace agreement probably on terms that were not that different from what ended up being the core terms of the Dayton Agreement in November 1995.
It is highly fascinating because, the official rhetoric, of course, is that, Bosnia is an example for when coercive force worked and the United States didn't want to do the bombings and NATO wanted to avoid using military force at any cost, but at the end of the day, it was the only thing that helped to kind of force the other side, the Bosnian Serbs, to the negotiating table. And out of that then comes this success story of the Dayton Peace Agreement, right? When in Ohio, Dayton, these sides met and Bill Clinton then announced, yeah, finally we've got a solution. But as other people on my channel, especially also Professor David Gibbs, pointed out, the Dayton Agreement is really not very different from the much earlier plan of 1992, the Vance-Owen's plan or 1991 even, the Europeans that brought forward a plan of how to stabilize Bosnia-Herzegovina. Could you maybe first talk a little bit about the political setup of Bosnia-Herzegovina at the time, what it was that actually then fractured them internally, I mean, in this process of Yugoslav dissolution, just to recap a little bit, and then this trajectory from Vance-Owens to Dayton. That's what we should understand also, like in the light of the documents that you found.
Sure. And I will tell it to you as best I can, basically from the perspective of the US intelligence community. And I think it's important to underline that this is a narrative that's not being told by people in the anti-war movement, for example. It is being told from people within the US government. So, I mean, effectively what happened was that in early 1992, the Bosnian president, Alija Izetbegovic, who was a member of the Bosnian Muslim community, decided on a path of Bosnian independence. Now, Slovenia and Croatia had already seceded from Yugoslavia at this point. And I think Izetbegovic's perspective was more or less that this put Bosnia in a bind in which they could either stay within Yugoslavia and be in a largely Serb-dominated rump Yugoslav state, or they could pursue independence and hope for some kind of unitary Bosnian state in which Muslims would be not quite the majority, but at least the plurality of around about 40% of the population. And the Croats and the Serbs would live basically as minorities within the state.
Yeah, so the Bosniaks would be the largest minority, the largest of their several groups. Yeah.
Yes. And the nature of Bosnia prior to the breakup of Yugoslavia was that it was sort of in some ways a miniature Yugoslavia, in that it held quite large numbers of the three most numerous nationalities within the Yugoslav system. And the largest group within Bosnia was the Muslims, or the Bosniaks as they became known throughout the war. That was a bit of a rebranding exercise. The Serbs, who were probably around about 30% of the population, and the Croats were probably around about 15%, and then other groups who wouldn't fit into those three made up the rest. And the general system under Yugoslavia is that they always operated, the three principal nationalities within Bosnia, they always operated on a consensus model and on a model of equality. But the fear, particularly among the Bosnian Serbs, when the Bosnian Muslim leadership pursued independence, was that that system of equality would be replaced by one in which they would be a minority within a Muslim state. And the way that the Bosnian leadership, or the Bosnian Muslim leadership, was able to achieve this effort in 1992 was, number one, by making an alliance with the Croat leaders against the Serbs, and number two, by enlisting the support of the United States. And I think that this is perhaps the most crucial moment in understanding the beginning of the war in Bosnia, which is when the United States recognized Bosnia's independence in April 1992. And that's when the tensions in Bosnia really erupted into a proper inferno and into a disastrous civil war. And by the way, I should say, even though this is not in my article, the US intelligence community predicted that. Lots of people predicted that, actually. The UN Secretary General predicted that as well. Many international diplomats predicted that, because they recognized that if Bosnia was to declare independence in this way, then the different national groups would fight to, in the case of the Serbs, stay within Yugoslavia. They would resist being pulled out of Yugoslavia into this newly created Bosnian state. And there would basically be a process of civil war and ethnic cleansing, which is, of course, exactly what happened. There were efforts at the time diplomatically led by European diplomats to try and stop the war from breaking out through something resembling a partition plan between the three nationalities in Bosnia. But that was, I think, undermined precisely by the fact that the United States backed Bosnian independence under the leadership of the Bosnian Muslims. And so then the war broke out. And this initial period was from April 1992 until the beginning of 1993, which is when this Vance-Owen plan was developed. Now, it's kind of two important things were going on at the same time here politically. You have the Vance-Owen plan, which is in fact a plan that's created by the representative of the United Nations, who was Cyrus Vance, and the representative of the European Community at the time, who was Lord David Owen, former British Foreign Secretary. And meanwhile, in the background, you had the US presidential election and the transition between the Bush senior administration and the Clinton administration in early 1993. Throughout that election campaign, so this is prior to the development of the Vance-Owen plan, but it's pretty critical to understand the context. Clinton was, let's put it simply, running to the right of Bush on Bosnia, saying that Bush and the Bush administration needed to entertain much more robust measures against the Bosnian Serb aggressors, as they were labeled by the US government at the time. And we could talk more about specifically what those measures were, but some of the main things were, for example, to more heavily arm the Bosnian government by lifting a UN arms embargo, also potentially to engage in airstrikes. So it was in this context that the Vance-Owen plan was being presented. And actually, the way that the Vance-Owen plan was discussed publicly and to some extent privately by US political leaders in early 1993 was that it was essentially appeasement of the Bosnian Serbs, even though they actually would make something of a correction to what you said before. The Vance-Owen plan was much more favorable to the vision of the Bosnian Muslims than the Dayton Agreement ended up being, because what it didn't do was create an autonomous Serbian republic within Bosnia. Now, that is what the Dayton Agreement did. The Vance-Owen plan instead came up with a plan of cantonization of Bosnia into different districts according to the different ethnic makeup of the regions within the country. It's a very, very complicated plan. And I think the long and short of it was that the US government was both publicly and privately opposing it, and or trying to adjust it in a way that would make it more favorable to the Bosnian Muslim side. Yeah. And so it was in that context that the intelligence community was repeatedly warning the US political leaders, particularly people in the National Security Council, not to come out so strongly against the Vance-Owen plan, not to essentially goad on the Bosnian Muslim leaders to reject it or to push for the hardest possible bargain, because the consequence would simply be the continuation of the war. In other words, the least bad option on the table, the intelligence community was saying very clearly at the time, was to accept this plan. It would probably end up becoming a partition of Bosnia, which wouldn't have been pretty. But I think that is what effectively ended up happening with the Dayton Agreement in 1995 anyway.
And may I just ask, like the Vance-Owen's plans are still included, of course, or as a matter of fact, Bosnia-Herzegovina as its own independent state outside of Yugoslavia, but in essence a highly federalized system with like different very strong, you called it cantons, like the Swiss model, I suppose, where the cantons are basically mini states, the way that the United States has big states but in a much smaller version, but with very strong local authority, including policing and so on. That wouldn't be on the federal level, and that at that point in end of 92, early 93, the war in Bosnia was still one that was fought mainly with like a couple of small arms, right? There were no large bombing campaigns, or were there? I mean, what was the nature of the fighting at the time?
Yeah, it was more on the ground fighting. So in terms of, for example, external airstrikes and military intervention of that kind, that only happened in a fairly minor way at the beginning of 1994, and then a much bigger way in September 1995. But at this stage of the war, it was the different groups fighting each other. I mean, at first, the Croats and the Muslims teamed up against the Serbs, but later on they also started fighting each other. And by the way, some of the worst atrocities of the war were actually committed in that basically Croat-Muslim civil war within a civil war. I mean, this was really a level of brutality that's very shocking to, I think, us, but I think definitely to everybody at the time as well. But it probably is fair to say that at this point in the war, the Bosnian Serbs had the upper hand. And part of the reason why they had the upper hand is because they also had weaponry from the Yugoslav National Army, which had retreated from Bosnia, but many of whose members were Bosnian Serbs as well. Now, it's important to just phrase it like that because the way that it was presented in the West and in Washington in particular was that there was an act of aggression that was carried out by the Bosnian Serbs in conjunction with the Yugoslav National Army. I think one has to be very careful with that framing of the issue because of the fact that the Bosnian Serbs were also Bosnians. They lived in Bosnia. They've been living in Bosnia for hundreds of years. And just by virtue of the fact that they served in the Yugoslav National Army did not make them international invaders. But because the United States recognized Bosnia as an independent state in April 1992, that was the framework. The framework was one of the valiant Bosnian government, self-declared and then recognized by the United States, obviously not recognized by the Bosnian Serbs or by what remained of Yugoslavia, fighting against foreign aggression. So that was kind of the framework in which they described the conflict. But at these early stages, the sort of intervention that was being contemplated in Washington was not yet airstrikes. There was definitely consideration of lifting this UN arms embargo to accelerate the provision of weapons to the Bosnian government side. It should be noted, by the way, that throughout the war, it was very obvious to the intelligence community that this arms embargo was being routinely violated. The US government was aware that this embargo was being routinely violated. And then there were also discussions about using the United Nations Protection Force, which was brought into Bosnia at the beginning of the war in April 1992, to basically reach or carry out some of the Bosnian government's objectives. And for example, what the Clinton administration pursued and the UN ended up adopting in the spring of 1993 was the concept of safe zones, which was basically that there would be certain areas within Bosnia that would be under the protection of the UN, ostensibly to allow humanitarian aid to come in. But as the CIA's Balkan task force warned from the beginning, the problem with creating these safe areas is that the Bosnian Muslim forces or the Bosnian government would use them as staging areas in order to launch attacks against Bosnian Serb forces.
Yeah.
And the Bosnian Serb forces would fight back, and then the UN would be caught in the middle.
Yeah. So which is exactly what happened, right? And the Serbs then said like, no, by virtue of the Bosnians starting attacks from there, they now lose their status, and we're going to counterattack. And then what you would have is these civilians who are there then being caught in the crossfire. Plus, as we learned later, you of course then also had like these military monsters that started slaughtering civilians, and Srebrenica, which stands so enigmatic for this for this violence, right? When the Serb army started killing Bosnian civilians, men above the age of 16, just because they wanted them gone, right? This genocidal mindset. So that also sets in. But all of this is created over time by the way that this situation was also, well, the way the situation developed. And what you're showing is that actually the US intelligence community had a very good grasp at the realities on the ground from the very beginning, right?
I would say so. They probably got some things wrong. I think for me, what's the more revealing thing is that whether the intelligence community was correct or not is maybe not necessarily the point. The point is that the US policy makers, the people in the National Security Council and the White House, they were aware of all of these warnings that having safe areas or safe zones would create these kinds of problems, that conducting airstrikes later on in the war would create all kinds of terrible humanitarian and political problems, that even talking about these kinds of things would encourage the Bosnian Muslim leadership, the Bosniak leadership, to be intransigent in any kind of peace negotiations. They were being told this from the very beginning from their own intelligence community in very voluminous and repeated reports. And they went ahead and did all of these things anyway.
Which part of the intelligence community was it? Was it mainly the CIA analysts?
Yes, primarily through the Balkan Task Force. But the Balkan Task Force also included people from other agencies who were carrying out intelligence assessments, but it's primarily the CIA.
Did you though find in your research any indications that the Clinton administration tried to use these task force findings in order to do the opposite? I mean, to pick and choose what they want and disregard all of these kind of warnings for a more precautionary way forward.
You know, during the war, and this is an important point to make about the documents on the one hand show the intelligence community's recommendations, but on the other hand, they also include memoranda written by intelligence community officials on meetings of National Security Council members. So basically commentary on what the policymakers are talking about, the key policymakers are talking about. And I mean, at different points of the war, there are very important policymakers who are much more influential than Clinton, but some of the key ones definitely would have been the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, definitely the UN ambassador of the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, Deputy National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, these kinds of officials. It seemed from the actual real life or real time examination of these documents, didn't seem to pay much attention to them at all. I don't think it was necessarily the fact that they picked and chose from them. I think they did that later after the war. I think they and unfortunately some scholars did this once these documents that I'm looking at were declassified. And actually some scholars who had access to the documents before they were declassified to the general public, they also used them, in my opinion, in a manipulative way. And I can talk more about that in a moment if you would like. But what was striking to me looking at the documents was really that there was not much of a connection at all between the policymakers and the intelligence community, that they were going in totally different directions. And I think that the general reason for that, it seemed to me, or the general theme for that, was that the Clinton administration had made all of these big promises throughout the 1992 election campaign. They had criticized the Bush administration for being too soft on Bosnia. They had demonized the Bosnian Serbs, and they had demonized the Serb president, Slobodan Milosevic, as well. And they had painted the war in a particular light. And once they had done that, it was very difficult to back down from it. And they were also facing significant political pressures in the US Congress as well to follow through on all of these promises or half promises that they made in the election campaign and then continued to make throughout the first year or two of the Clinton administration.
I understand that reasoning for like then basically pinning yourself into a corner. However, they had to do exactly that, right? 1995, Dayton then basically is the reversal of all of these policies and also a what do we call that? Like a PR reversal, right? Let's shift gears and then sell it as we managed to bring peace through the failed effort of using force. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that shift? Maybe less on the intelligence side, but on like 1995. How was this? How did this rebranding happen? Because until this day, people keep mentioning Dayton, Ohio as this moment of successful, then U.S. peace diplomacy after the unfortunate use of force.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's in some ways the critical part of the story. So I'll try and give you the key details about that because I think it's important for us to understand them. I will say, I think from the documents I looked at, I can't give you a 100% decisive moment or reason why the administration policy makers shifted in the way that they did, but there are certainly pieces of evidence that indicate why they did and when they did. And why they did, it seems, again, in general terms, basically domestic political considerations, because by 1995, the war had been going on for the entire first term of the Clinton administration, and there was a presidential election coming up in 1996. So it was an embarrassment and a humiliation to the Clinton administration. They wanted to end the war. Okay, so that's essentially, I think, the simple story. That's also made clear in a number of the documents that I looked at, but also wouldn't take a genius or much rocket science in order to put that story together. Pretty commonsensical sort of story. Now, in terms of when they actually pushed for the peace agreement with Dayton, the fall of Srebrenica to the Bosnian Serb forces in July 1995 was probably a critical moment, but I don't think it was a critical moment in the way that it's been presented in what we might call the conventional or dominant narrative about the road to Dayton. I think the way that it's presented in this conventional or dominant narrative, which, as I note in my article, is maybe best demonstrated in these books by Derek Chollet and Ivo Dolder, who were basically junior officials working under key Clinton administration officials during the war, books that ended up being very widely cited. The general perception there was that the fall of Srebrenica and then the massacre that came with it, with the Bosnian Serb takeover, was so shocking to the US policymakers and to the international community that they simply could not avoid intervening after that. That this was something that was so abhorrent that it was necessary to intervene. And it was possible at that point to move NATO and the UN to also support some form of more aggressive military intervention. And that military intervention ultimately forced the previously intransigent Bosnian Serbs to the negotiating table. So that's essentially the narrative that they presented. Here's what really happened. When Srebrenica fell, Anthony Lake, the National Security Advisor, wrote a paper which was referred to as the Endgame paper, and different departments wrote different Endgame papers. Lake wrote one in which he said the fall of Srebrenica and possibly Žepa, which was another small town that was a safe zone as well in eastern Bosnia, is actually an opportunity for the Clinton administration because it is going to make the Bosnian government more willing to entertain realistic solutions and compromises to end the war.
Not the Serbian, the Bosnian government. The side that the US had been supporting for 3.5 years at this point. Yeah,
correct.
Their own allies. Yeah,
correct. So it was a terrible blow to the Bosnian government and the Bosnian Muslim forces, and it was an atrocity as well. I think there's no doubt about that. But the diplomatic aspect of it was actually that this provided an opportunity to bring about the end of the war, because Srebrenica was a very, very awkward issue for the US government. And it was a very awkward issue for anyone who wanted to bring about a peace agreement because it was an enclave within Serb-held territory.
Right.
So if you want to come up with a map, which by that point, the US government was pretty much accepting that there's going to be pretty much a division, de facto, if not a de jure partition of Bosnia between a predominantly Serb region and then a region shared by Croats and Muslims. Srebrenica and other enclaves were very, very problematic in that context. So getting rid of Srebrenica as an issue was actually quite useful from the perspective of people within the US government who wanted to end the war by this point. So it's kind of cynical, I would say. It's certainly cynical because also in public they presented the defense of Srebrenica as being absolutely vital in some way. Exactly in what way, I think, was a little bit unclear. I mean, maybe to stop Serb aggression, stop ethnic cleansing, however they wanted to present it. But they knew, I think it's very clear from the documents that I've looked at, I think there's other documentation for this as well. They knew that Srebrenica was going to fall to the Bosnian Serb side at some point. And yet they kept up this charade of defending it. So when it fell, they actually saw this as a diplomatic opportunity. And it really was from there that the US government became much more willing to force significant concessions onto the Bosnian government. And I think that these concessions were made easier for the US government, not necessarily for the Bosnian government, by the substantial air campaign against the Bosnian Serb forces later in the year, or pretty soon thereafter the fall of Srebrenica, because this allowed the US government to basically avoid the embarrassment of recognizing the reality being that they had essentially accepted defeat. That they had essentially accepted the fact that they had made promises to the Bosnian government that they couldn't keep. So the bombing was able to disguise that. The documentary record is very clear. The Balkan Task Force was very clear that just before the bombing started, week before the bombing started, the Balkan Task Force said, "We don't understand why Richard Holbrooke, the chief negotiator of the Dayton Agreement, is presenting the Bosnian Serbs as the main problem. It's very clear to us that the Bosnian government is the main problem here. The Bosnian Serbs are ready to deal." This is exactly what the Balkan Task Force said. They're ready to deal. This before they were bombed in late August and through into September 1995.
You know what this reminds me of? The talk I had last week with Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, who actually said, the pick of defeat needs a lot of lipstick to be sold, right? And he said that now in the context of the Ukraine war, because his analysis is that that war is also basically lost, and now we're in the dressing up phase. And what you're saying is that there was a dressing up phase, and that actually the aerial bombardment campaign was part of the lipstick on the pick that basically got, well, that was there and de facto unavoidable once Srebrenica had fallen, that actually these people recognized the diplomatic value to negotiate with their own partners, right? To say like, guys, look, it's now a reality, so you better swallow this because it's in our interest now to do this, because now 3 years later our interest is not to back you up, as they say, like whatever it takes, right? The Ukraine, whatever it takes, how long ever it takes, right? That's the narrative in the beginning, and in the end, it's like, well, now maybe it doesn't take that much anymore.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, earlier on in the war, all of the public rhetoric was Srebrenica can't fall, the safe areas can't fall. Somehow the fate of civilization depends upon these small towns in eastern Bosnia. But behind the scenes, they recognize, certainly the intelligence community recognizes, but I think on some level the policymakers also recognize that at some point they're going to have to give all of this up. And yes, I think the bombing campaign was, it's a good way of putting it, the lipstick on the pig. It's worth maybe just briefly saying what the pig consisted of at that time. And the principal thing that it consisted of was permitting the creation of Republika Srpska, as it's currently known, the Serbian Republic, within Bosnia on 49% of Bosnian territory, with substantial autonomy, with not a right to secede, which, by the way, Madeleine Albright, the big hawk, and Anthony Lake, the national security advisor, were actually at one point willing to grant the Bosnian Serbs as the price for peace after the fall of Srebrenica. That didn't end up in the Dayton Agreement, but what did end up in the Dayton Agreement was that the Republika Srpska would have the right to a special association or special parallel relationships with what remained of Yugoslavia, which at that time was Serbia and Montenegro. So that was one massive concession that many people in the Bosnian government, it's also worth saying, think not necessarily a unified Bosnian government position. There were lots of divisions that the Americans were complaining about a lot at Dayton. But they did not like this idea because this looked a lot like basically partition, which in a sense, I think it probably was. And obviously then the other piece was the fact that they had to lose these enclaves that they had been fighting to cling on to as well. So on the land issue and on the constitutional issue, there were some very difficult pills to swallow for the Bosnian government. And the accounts of the Dayton negotiations themselves, to be fair, some of these have actually been acknowledged by people who are otherwise kind of celebrating what the Clinton administration officials did on the road to Dayton. I recognize that there was a lot of arm twisting of the Bosnian government officials by Richard Holbrooke and also from Anthony Lake when he made his key appearance at Dayton towards the end of the talks in order to push a breakthrough. In fact, I would say, just apropos of what you said before with respect to the Ukraine war, Trump, Zelensky, and J.D. Vance had this famous or infamous meeting in the White House earlier in the year where Trump and Vance told Zelensky, give it up, it's over. Pretty much the same conversations, almost word for word, and you can read them towards the end of my article, were had between Richard Holbrooke and Ali Izetbegovic, and also Harasilajic, who was the prime minister of Bosnia at the time. Harasilajic yelled back at Holbrooke, "This is no way that you should treat a Bosnian government official." And Anthony Lake was given instructions when he was coming to give the breakthrough intervention in the Dayton Agreement that if the Bosnian government does not sign up to this deal, which is now going to be recognized by Slobodan Milosevic negotiating on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs, then you're not going to get the economic reconstruction money that you've been asking for. You're not going to get this train and equip program for your army that you've been asking for and that we've promised you. We're going to take the UNPROFOR UN protective force out of Bosnia. We're going to actually have a proper arms embargo against you. You're going to be screwed. So exactly the kind of conversation that Trump and Vance were bringing out in public with Zelensky, but had in private in the latter months of 1995.
Fascinating how these dynamics of inter-alliance coercion and so on repeat time and again between the stronger and the client party. But let me ask you, because I never actually understood, why is it that they were so adamantly against the Serbian part of Bosnia to actually join the rest of Yugoslavia? I mean, at this point, the Western powers had made a very important point of recognizing the right to secede, right, from recognized state, even against that state's constitution. The right of minorities for self-determination was held like a big flag of freedom above everybody, which then flies in the face, of course, of today's Ukraine. And the constitutional order needs to be kept at any cost, and we cannot accept illegal secessionist referenda and so on. I mean, let's not go into the hypocrisy, but at the time, so how did they defend this idea that we cannot get the Serbs their part of the way they would like to see the future also be? Like, why could Bosnia not be split up? Because, and just one thing, like I visited Bosnia and Herzegovina twice, and the one thing that seems clear to me is that the only thing they agree upon is that they don't want to be together, these three parts. Why was that not an option at the time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think some of it is related to the different political concerns and very narrow domestic political interests that I was talking about before, in the sense that the Clinton campaign in 1992 had accused the Bush administration of being very soft on the Bosnian Serb aggressors, and the Serb aggressors sponsoring them from Belgrade as well. Again, I think aggressors should probably be in scare quotes. And they found it very difficult to back down from that position. But yes, I mean, obviously there was an issue in terms of the legality and constitutionality of secession. I mean, what the Badinter Commission did, that was ostensibly an arbitration commission established by the European negotiators as Yugoslavia was beginning to collapse, very, very early on in the collapse of Yugoslavia, did actually stop short of talking about a right to secession, which is very interesting. And by the way, same thing in 2008, when Western countries recognized Kosovo's secession from Serbia. They did not say that it's on the basis of national self-determination. Very important that they didn't make that declaration, or ethnic or linguistic self-determination. The Badinter Commission said that Yugoslavia was a state that was in the process of dissolution, which is very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's in the process of dissolution because people are trying to secede from it. You recognize their right to secede from it because it's in the process of dissolution. It's going to keep dissolving.
It's circular logic.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it was a very serious legal argument, but that at any rate was the legal argument that was made at the time. And there was a right within the Yugoslav constitution for republics to secede, but not unilaterally. And not violently, which is what happened. So yeah, I think it was naturally the case that the Bosnian Serb leaders, and also Serb leaders in Belgrade as well, said, if they can secede, then why can't we secede from that, or why can't we stay in Yugoslavia? It's very, of course, all this language around secession more generally is very politicized. I mean, you're right, we shouldn't get too far down that rabbit hole because there's a lot of hypocrisy there, but the Bosnian Serbs who created this Bosnian Serb Republic at the beginning of the war in Bosnia, they were described in the Western press, and also, frankly, in all the documents that I looked at as well, as secessionists.
Yeah.
And that term, I think, carries a lot of baggage. But why weren't they referred to as loyalists? They could have, I think, plausibly been referred to as loyalists, because their original positions is they wanted to stay within Yugoslavia. So they're actually loyalists. And the Bosnian Muslims were trying to break away along with the Croats, or the leadership of these communities trying to do that. Why weren't they referred to as secessionists? Why weren't the Croatian leaders who did the same thing at the end of 1991, or began to do it earlier in 1991, why weren't they referred to as secessionists as well? So there was all of this stuff that was there, I think, to, in some ways, just disguise the basic political situation. And I'll just add one other thing. I mean, Madeleine Albright was a pretty influential person within the Clinton administration. And Madeleine Albright had, I think, a different kind of approach to all of this. I mean, Albright sort of presented herself as let's say, the Serb whisperer. Okay, that she knows, she said, and she also said when these documents were declassified in 2013, she knows the mentality of the region. Very kind of Orientalist approach, right? How does she know the mentality of the region? Okay, she's born in the Czech Republic. It's not quite southern Slav territory. Oh, okay, but she was in Belgrade when her father was ambassador to Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1948. I think she was 8 years old to 11 years old. So maybe that's when she developed her understanding of the mentality of the Serbs. But she was always within the administration, publicly and privately, making the case that it borderline, or maybe not even borderline, I think very prejudiced kind of arguments that basically the Serbs are Slavic savages, and that this was probably an idea that took hold of a lot of people within the administration as well, or at least was a powerful rhetorical device to justify refusing the Serbs the right to self-determination that had been so enthusiastically granted to the Bosnian Muslims.
And what follows from that then is, of course, in order to negotiate with them, you have to bomb them, right? You have to be militarily strong in order to bring them to their senses. And let's not forget, she's the 1 million dead Iraqis worth it kind of Madeleine Albright, right? It's like some of these people who have no regard for human life, especially not the one that they oppose. But the branding is very successful in terms of saying, like, I know these people, just as we today hear a lot of people who tell us that they know exactly how the Russians work. The Russians only understand force. Therefore, if we're weak, then we're giving it all up, and that the road forward is the road. I mean, bombs, weapons are the road to peace. Or how did he phrase that, Stoltenberg? Weapons are the way to peace. That kind of mentality, right?
Yeah, the only language they understand is force, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, Albright, and in Albright, just more broadly, it's interesting because she did seem to recognize, I mean, I said they didn't really engage with the intelligence community assessment, but she did seem to recognize some of their concerns. I mean, she was advocating within the administration for airstrikes in 1993, and she said, yeah, airstrikes probably will create a humanitarian disaster, and they probably will make the work of UNPROFOR, the UN Protective Force, impossible. But we should still consider.
It's a political tool, right? I mean, creating a humanitarian catastrophe can be very bad for the other side. Therefore, we should consider it. I mean, that's the psychopathic mentality, which I think. I mean, she was very truthful. I mean, she's not.
Yeah, although it's worth keeping in mind. Sorry to butt in on this, but it is worth keeping in mind just to emphasize what I said before. Something that's not been publicized, so far as I can see, until I put it in this article. So if you want one little tidbit that's useful for readers, viewers, listeners, or whatever, it's the fact that Albright wrote her own endgame paper after the fall of Srebrenica, talking about how the war should come to an end. And of course, she's got her usual stuff in there about needing to bomb the Bosnian Serbs to their senses and so on. But she also says, as the price for peace, we should consider granting the Bosnian Serbs the right to secede and join a greater Serbia, and we should also consider allowing for population transfers in order to make the map more palatable. This is the same Madeleine Albright that was saying both publicly and privately 2 years before that things like this were totally inconceivable, and that legitimizing ethnic cleansing would be a total disaster for global security. It would send a terrible example to other tyrants and other war criminals across the world. And yeah, then she's saying essentially, if it's the price for peace, we have to ratify it, and we also have to recognize the right of Serbs to join a greater Serbia. And she even used that expression, greater Serbia, as well, in the document. So, you know, she also gave this persona in public, and I think Derek Chollet and Ivo Dolder, who wrote these books about the road to Dayton, they also presented her as the sort of the tough person within the administration who really pushed for this heroic military intervention towards the end. Well, it's not the whole story. There's also some realization of the real situation from her as well.
So in a sense, like, she too actually was more concerned about the election in 96, probably, and peace at this moment, bringing it, winding it down, overwrote like these previous statements, whether they were meant seriously or not, but they overwrote that, also meaning that, okay, now it's okay if I contradict myself, because if somebody points it out, I'll just laugh it off, but it's more important that we wind it down now. So in a sense, then the military reality forced them to come around, right, and change their positions on what they thought was acceptable as a way that this whole thing ends.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I would put it. That they belatedly recognized the reality that the US intelligence community recognized from the beginning of the war. And obviously, the logical question that flows from that, this is beyond our sort of scholarly discussion about what's in the documents or whatever, but why didn't they recognize this earlier? Why didn't the policymakers recognize this earlier? And what were the costs of them not recognizing this earlier? And I think this is the key point. Basically, in order to avoid being embarrassed politically, they sacrificed the lives of thousands and thousands of people in Bosnia, Muslims, Croats, and Serbs alike. I think that disproportionately in total, the biggest victims were Bosnian Muslims, but all of the communities suffered in different ways as a result of the war. And in some sense, it seems as though they suffered as a result of the war so that the Clinton administration officials would not lose credibility or prestige or be embarrassed as a result of climbing down from their very lofty public rhetoric about Serb aggression.
Yeah, I think Madeleine Albright put it perfectly. It was worth it. We considered it worth it.
It's
like, for us, having this war and fighting it and seeing how it goes and being able to sell ourselves was worth that, as horrible as it is. But
yeah, obviously it was such a disastrous moment when she said that about these horrible sanctions against Iraq that had these practically genocidal effects on the Iraqi civilian population. But I think she pretty much said the same thing in the context of Bosnia as well.
No, because the mistake that we are often making when we describe these moments as disastrous, right? The disastrous Bosnia policy or the disastrous Vietnam policy is that we think from the perspective of humanitarianism.
Yeah.
I mean, Clinton got reelected in 96.
Correct.
It worked. I mean, it worked. And he's the peace president of 95, right?
Right.
And in a sense, they got all they needed.
They did. They got what they needed. And the narrative is kind of persisted. And this is kind of why I wanted to write this article in the first place, is that, you had Derek Chollet, who was working kind of informally as a speechwriter for Richard Holbrooke. And you had Ivo Dolder, who was working in the National Security Council for Anthony Lake. And then you had all of these officials themselves who presented these very heroic narratives of the road to Dayton afterwards. These people ended up in future Democratic administrations. This is how their career was created. So Dolder and Chollet, both of them ended up in the Obama administration. Chollet was also in the Biden administration, in the Blinken State Department, working on Gaza policy and Ukraine policy. And, the other thing in addition to this that I've always found quite perplexing is that there's also perhaps an element on the left as well that has accepted some of this narrative. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it seems to be so. I mean, for example, I've written a few times.
Because of the humanitarian issue, because Srebrenica was so horrible. Until today, I had academics blow up in my face in Kyoto, telling me that peace with Russia is unthinkable because we cannot allow another Srebrenica. It has burned itself into left-wing ideology, even within the academic community. So it was very, very useful in order to swing, these peaceniks away from their approach.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that as well. And I suppose we can be sympathetic somewhat to that point of view as well, because there are real atrocities and people want to do something about it.
They were real. They were horrible. But
exactly. But
the problem is, why could they happen?
Yeah, and what do you do about it? And I always think it's a fairly fundamental principle that anyone should use, left, right, anyone concerned with foreign relations, if they're active in it or they're studying it. Okay, there's a problem, there's a disaster, there's a catastrophe, there's a war. What can we do to make it better?
Yeah.
What will we do that might make it worse? And I think that this is the point where I think in a lot of these contexts, people get overwhelmed by the atrocity imagery, which is also often very significant and profound. And as a result of that, they don't think through that question, well, is the policy that's actually being pursued useful? Or is it just going to make the situation worse?
Yeah, but you actually see these tactics also repeat and the learning effect. I am I have no proof for what I'm going to say now, but the people who created the narrative around Bucha, I'm pretty sure they got inspired by Srebrenica because it's understandable how much you can cook up the sentiment and so on the ground in the West with these kind of atrocity imagery and so on and so forth. But okay, I have no proof for this. This is pure speculation. But when we come back to what we now see is that that your research and research of other people shows how Dayton, in fact, was a reversal of previous policy in '92, and how it was a coming around of the U.S. Position toward what could have been achieved 3 years earlier through Vance-Owen's this plan, and how this was successfully also rebranded, though, as a success, not just of peace, but of peace through strength, as Donald Trump would put it today. Do you want to say something more about this, or did we cover it?
I think that's pretty well covered. Yeah, peace through strength, coercive diplomacy, the lionization of the all-American hero Richard Holbrooke coming in to save the day at the last moment in sort of John Wayne Western movie fashion, but with modern weapons and modern technology, bombing and bullying people to the negotiating table. It's a good Hollywood story in a certain sense, and it's certainly a good story for people within the Clinton administration who want to paint this record of abject failure as one of success.
Yeah. And maybe at this point, if anyone watching this program has been working at the time within the media and is knowledgeable on spin doctorship of how to do this, of how to put the lipstick successfully on the pig, please do reach out, because that would be another element to explore here, because it's very, very important, actually, that this was a successful rebranding of a policy reversal and how that got to stick in the public imagination. We will probably also need to talk then, of course, what happened later, right, up to the NATO bombing of Belgrade in '99, because the Yugoslav wars were not over at all. But the Bosnia part of it kind of wound down after '95, and again, Clinton successfully got reelected. Harry, this was very, very good research and very good information. People who want to find your work, I will of course link the article that we just discussed in the video description below. But can people find you somewhere else where you write?
Well, right now, I was thinking in advance for our interview, I knew you'd ask me that. I was thinking I should get myself a proper website together. I don't yet have one. I think probably in the meantime, people should just follow me on Twitter, I suppose. It's just at @Blain. I think that's the best place to start. I'll post stuff there from time to time. And soon enough, I will post a website there where I'll have more up-to-date work on this and other issues as well.
One thing I can warmly recommend, which is easier to maintain than a web page, is actually a Substack. Substack has a lot of benefits also because it distributes your work and it combines the best of an email list with a homepage.
That's good. All right, good.
It's really good because it then distributes stuff. Because the problem with the homepage is like people need to go and click and land there, and almost how many times do you access a homepage? But on a mailing list, it pushes out, and every once in a while it also grows a little bit. So that's my recommendation would be Substack for good, like for also proper academic discussions. But leave it up to you, and I'll put it into the description for sure.
Great. Cool.
Well, this was a fascinating talk. Harry Blain, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Pascal.